It's funny how often those conversations about like growing up in church end up being either hilarious or like kind of horrifying. It's a shared experience. But then you bring in being autistic, and well, that's a whole other deep dive,
Absolutely.
which is what we're doing today because you've shared some of your own story with like religious trauma and how being on the spectrum adds this whole other layer to it.
Right.
So we're diving into this blog post called Cheap ABA, and no, before anyone asks, not that kind of ADA. This is about healing from what the author calls RTS, religious trauma syndrome, but specifically for autistic folks. And they make a point that really resonated how common RTS actually is.
Yeah.
We just don't always, talk about it openly.
Yeah, and what's so interesting is how the post really points out that all those common things we think of with religious trauma, the guilt, the shame, feeling isolated, those can get amplified when you're autistic.
Intensified, right? Like we've all felt that pressure to fit in, but with autism, imagine constantly hearing that your sensory stuff, how you communicate, even just stimming that it's wrong, even sinful, heavy stuff.
It really is, especially during those years when you're still figuring out who you are.
Formative years. Yeah.
Exactly. And this is where the post starts to offer some hope, because simply recognizing this, like naming it, that's incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
Validates the struggle.
Yeah.
It's the first step to healing.
Okay, so less dwelling on the problem, more about solutions.
Right.
And Sheep ABA breaks it down into three main areas, which I gotta say, a good framework always helps me feel like I can actually do something.
Structure is key, especially with something as emotionally heavy as trauma. It's like a roadmap.
Absolutely. So pillar number one, and this one comes up again and again in the post, is therapy. But not just any therapy, it's got to be tailored for you. Finding a therapist who gets both autism and religious trauma, that's crucial.
It's not a one-size-fits-all situation at all. A therapist who understands autism, they'll recognize, like, if the session itself is causing sensory overload, that's working against you. Or that direct communication, even about tough stuff, might be more helpful than, dancing around it.
And then on the flip side, you've got someone specializing in religious trauma. They're not going to pathologize your experience, try to shove you back into that box you fought so hard to get out of.
Right. It's about that sweet spot. Someone who gets your experience as an autistic person while they're helping you heal from the trauma. And they actually suggest, to help narrow it down, look for therapists who specifically say they have experience with both, like on their website or profile.
Ooh, good tip.
Online directories like Psychology Today can be helpful for that.
Love that. Now, they also talk about a few types of therapy to consider. CBT, for example, which, I'll be honest, I always thought was just about, like, thinking happy thoughts, slap on a smile, and everything's fine.
Good common misconception. CBT is really powerful, but for challenging those deep down negative thought patterns that religious trauma can, like, bake into your brain.
Okay, so less fake smiling, more like rewiring your brain.
Yeah, think of it like this. If you've learned to operate under a certain set of religious rules, CBT helps you rewrite those rules, but based on your values, your reality.
Which, let's be real, after years of rigid doctrine, probably needs a good rewiring.
Exactly. And then there's trauma-informed therapy. It recognizes how trauma impacts your whole life and really puts safety, trust, and that feeling of empowerment first and foremost.
Which makes sense when dealing with trauma. Like, you gotta feel safe enough to even begin unpacking that stuff. And this is where it gets interesting. They even mention play therapy. At first I thought, am I reading this right?
That might sound a little out there.
It did.
But play therapy can be really effective, even for adults. It's about tapping into that natural human need to play, to be creative, as a way to process these big emotions.
So, not literally building Lego towers in session, unless that works for you, I guess.
Exactly. It's about what works for you.
Mm-hmm.
Some therapists use art, music, storytelling. It's all about finding that path to access those deeper emotions.
Meeting you where you're at, which for autistic people who maybe find traditional talk therapy tricky, that's huge.
For sure.
Okay, that's one pillar down. But therapy's just one piece, right? They also talk about mindfulness. Now, before you picture me like meditating on a mountaintop,
Right.
because that ain't happening.
It's not about becoming a monk or even spending hours in silent contemplation. It's about those everyday tools you can use to deal with the emotional fallout that religious trauma can leave you with.
So real world stuff. Give me the down and dirty. What's that actually look like?
They highlight a few key things, starting with meditation, but again, not the hours-long kind. Even just a few minutes of guided meditation, specifically for trauma, that can be huge.
Guided, okay. Because, especially early on, just being alone with my thoughts Not exactly a recipe for inner peace.
Exactly. That's why guided is so helpful. It provides that structure, a safe way to explore your inner world without feeling totally overwhelmed.
So more like a gentle guide leading you through a forest, less like airdropped into the wilderness to fend for yourself.
Exactly. And then there's breath work, learning how to regulate your breathing, especially when anxiety hits. Seems simple, but super grounding.
I'm all about breath work. That box breathing thing. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. Surprisingly effective.
It's amazing how such a simple technique can have such a huge impact, right? And you can do it anytime, anywhere.
No equipment needed. Love it. And you know what else I find helpful? Just being in nature. When it's all too much, nature can be like hitting the reset button on my whole system.
Nature has this incredible ability to soothe us. Yeah, walk in the park, gardening, even just sitting under a tree.
And especially for us autistic folks who can be extra sensitive to sensory input, nature's a lifesaver.
Absolutely. It's predictable, it's calm, it can be really regulating.
So we've got therapy tailored to you, practical mindfulness, and the final pillar, cheap ABA talks about, is building your support system, which, I mean, duh, right? But they get into the specifics, which I always appreciate.
Because it's not just about having people around you, it's about finding your people, people who get it, who understand what it's like to heal from religious trauma as an autistic person.
Okay, so where do we find these mythical creatures? Because they're not exactly listed in the phone book under religious trauma support for autistic adults. Although,
Mhm.
maybe that's not a bad idea.
We should patent that. But seriously, there are great places to start. Online support groups are huge. Facebook groups, forums, they can really provide that sense of community knowing you're not alone.
So important, especially if you're not ready for like face-to-face interaction or haven't found that local group yet. Online spaces can be a lifeline. And it's funny, sometimes the most supportive groups online are the ones you'd least expect.
Oh, tell me about it. It's not always about finding that group that's like specifically religious trauma and autism. Sometimes it's more about the shared experience,
Yeah.
Even if their path to it was different.
Right. Like I found this amazing group. It was for neurodivergent folks who'd left like high control environments, not even specifically religious. Some were ex-cult, some from restrictive families, even folks from toxic workplaces.
Interesting.
But that common thread, that feeling of being controlled, pressured to conform, it was so relatable.
That makes sense, though.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's about feeling seen, understood, and sometimes that comes from people who've just been there, even if the details are different.
Exactly. And that reminds me, Cheap ABA talks about finding the right therapist. They say over and over, it's not one size fits all.
Couldn't agree more. Finding that mental health professional who gets trauma, but also understands how autism plays into it. Huge. It's about you feeling safe, understood, empowered to heal on your terms.
And they even give tips like check online directories, the ones that let you filter by specialty. Psychology Today, or even just Googling therapists in your town who specialize in both.
And don't be afraid to, shop around a little. Have a few initial consultations. It's okay. It's a big decision. You want someone you trust, connect with.
Totally. Because when you're unpacking something as personal, as potentially painful as religious trauma, that feeling of safety, of being understood, that's non-negotiable.
Absolutely.
Now, I know we've talked about therapy a lot, but they hammer it home in the post.
For good reason.
Yeah.
It can be so valuable, especially when you combine it with the other stuff we talked about. Mindfulness, community. Healing takes a lot of different tools, finding what works for you.
Speaking of that your squad thing, even with a great therapist, supportive online groups, there's still that day-to-day stuff to navigate. Family things, holidays, even just seeing religious symbols or hearing certain phrases out in the world.
Ugh, yeah, like those old wounds getting ripped open right when you thought they were healing. And those triggers, they can be even more intense for autistic people.
Oh, 100%.
Because you might already be dealing with sensory overload or anxiety from social situations, then this gets piled on top.
Exactly. Like for me, it's those big, loud church services. Just thinking about that environment, my anxiety's through the roof.
Like your body remembers the discomfort, the sensory overload, the pressure, even if your mind has moved on. Totally valid response.
So what do we do? Become hermits? Just avoid anything remotely related to our pasts?
Well, tempting as hiding under a rock might sound, it's not always realistic. Or, frankly, enjoyable. It's about finding that balance, honoring your needs while also reclaiming your power.
Okay, I like where you're going with this, but how do we actually do that?
Start with self-awareness. Pay attention to what your triggers are.
Yeah.
Specific people. places, even certain words or phrases.
Okay.
Once you know what sets you off, then you can build those coping mechanisms.
So like a mental toolbox of strategies.
Exactly. And those tools, they'll be unique to you. Some people, it's mindfulness practices, grounding techniques, sensory stuff.
Right. Like if I'm overwhelmed, sometimes a fidget toy or my go-to calming music, it makes all the difference.
Exactly. It's about what helps you feel safe, grounded, and sometimes, honestly, it's about setting boundaries. If you know a certain event, situation, whatever is going to be triggering, it's okay to say no. You don't owe anyone an explanation.
Permission to opt out. Love it.
Your well-being is important. Sometimes self-care is about protecting your energy, putting your mental health first.
And you know what's interesting? The post touches on this idea that healing from religious trauma, especially as an autistic person, it's not just about dealing with the past, but building a future that feels authentic. Yours.
It's about reclaiming your own narrative, your values, your sense of self. And sometimes that means letting go of what you should be doing, who you should be, and figuring out what you actually want.
Which, easier said than done, especially when you've spent years with those shoulds echoing in your head, trying to fit this mold that never felt right.
Oh, absolutely. It's a process. Takes time to unlearn those patterns, but it's possible. And this is where I think that idea of toxic shame comes in, that belief that you're just inherently flawed, unworthy. Often stuff we get told as kids, tying our worth to how well we follow the rules.
Okay, toxic shame. Big word. Unpack that a little. I think I get it, but...
So imagine growing up told that anytime you deviate from these super strict rules, you're bad, unlovable even.
Ooh.
And then those rules get so ingrained, you start policing yourself, constantly on edge, waiting for that next mistake.
Wow. Getting childhood flashbacks just hearing you describe it.
And for autistic people who might already be struggling to navigate a world that doesn't get their neurodiversity, those messages of wrongness, extra damaging, every stim, every struggle to make eye contact, every meltdown, it reinforces that feeling of being broken, not good enough.
That's heartbreaking. And it makes me think how many of us, myself included, we internalize that shame and carry it around long after we've left those environments.
So common, unfortunately. But here's the thing. It's not your fault. Those messages, they were never about you as an individual. It's about a system that needs control to survive.
It's like you're told you're this square peg, gotta fit in the round hole, and then you believe it's your fault you don't fit. No wonder we feel broken.
Right. Recipe for self-doubt. But the good news is we can change the narrative. It starts by realizing those shame messages, not about our actual worth, more about a system that needs control.
So how do we untangle from that? Those beliefs run deep.
Therapy's huge here. A good therapist, they give you that safe space to explore the shame, reframe the negative, and start building self-compassion.
Self-compassion,
Yeah.
big one. So easy to be hard on ourselves, especially when we're already feeling vulnerable.
Absolutely. That's why it's treating ourselves with the same kindness we'd give a friend. We're all works in progress, right? We deserve love, acceptance, even with the so-called flaws.
Giving ourselves permission to be human, quirks and all.
Exactly. And that includes the autism, right? When we can accept and even celebrate that part of us, it chips away at the shame telling us we're not enough.
Love that. Okay, so we've talked about individual healing a lot, but I want to go back to something from Cheap ABA, that idea about changing religious communities themselves. Like, we need individual strategies, sure, but if we don't address the system, it's incomplete, right?
100%. And this is where the whole neurodiversity movement is so powerful. When we shift from fixing autistic people to accepting and valuing them as they are, it forces a change in what's considered normal.
From fear and judgment to, like, curiosity and compassion.
Exactly. And that shift,
Yeah.
huge for religious communities, many of which have, let's be honest, pathologized or pushed aside anyone who doesn't fit their mold.
It's like that saying, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. The spectrum's huge, so acting like there's a one-size-fits-all for spirituality, not only insensitive, it's harmful.
Totally. Instead of, how do we make autistic people fit in?
Right.
It should be, how do we create space where everyone feels welcome, no matter where they're at on the spectrum?
So how do we start those conversations? Religion's a touchy subject.
You're not wrong. But I think it's about meeting people where they are, less about confrontation, more like an invitation to learn, to grow.
Less you're doing it wrong, more like, hey, this has been helpful for me. Maybe you'll find it useful too.
Exactly. Sharing our own experiences authentically and inviting others in. With curiosity, openness, not defensiveness.
And maybe, just maybe, that sparks something bigger. Real change within these communities.
I believe it's possible. It's those brave conversations, challenging the way things have always been done, amplifying autistic voices.
Creating a world where everyone, no matter where they fall on the spectrum, feels seen, heard, loved for who they are. A world where religious trauma isn't the norm, but a distant memory.
Beautifully said. And that's a future worth fighting for.
It really is. So if you're listening and this resonated, you're not alone. Healing is out there. There's support, there's resources. And never underestimate the power of your voice in creating a world that's more inclusive, more compassionate.
Your story matters. Your experiences matter. And you deserve to be heard.
And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions, keep challenging those beliefs that hold you back, and keep fighting for a world where everyone feels safe, seen, and celebrated for exactly who they are.